Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very powerful show coming right up. Have you ever wondered what to do when your marriage or relationship hits bumps? Well, Dr. Daphne de Marneffe is here today to talk to us about her new book, The Rough Patch: Marriage and the Art of Living Together. So Dr. Daphne is a couples therapist and psychologist who explores why marriages today are harder than ever before and what we can do about that to make it through these tough times. With the stresses of everyday life, today's marriages can feel overwhelming. We're living longer, our parents are living longer, there's financial and work-life pressures and strains. So today, Dr. Daphne is here to share with us how we can make it through the rough patch. So let's welcome to the show, Dr. Daphne.
Thank you so much.
It is such a pleasure to have you here, and my goodness, I could see why people are saying your book is like reading poetry. It's so well written.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, and so what has inspired you to follow this path?
You mean writing this particular book?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, I've been a therapist for quite a while, and I've been a therapist with couples for quite a while. And I started noticing several years ago a phenomenon where people were coming into my office either as a couple or as individuals, and they might have been kind of in their early 40s. They'd sort of, picked their life partner and moved to the town they were going to live in, and their kids are in school, and they had this sense that they had built the structure of their lives, but that they were almost kind of going through the motions, or that they felt very kind of stuck or lost in some sense, or sad in their primary love relationship. And they really didn't understand why, and they didn't know what to do. And as I listened to them, I felt that there was a way in which people talked in a kind of almost embarrassed way about this, or a kind of dismissive way, or even a trivializing way, where they'd sort of say, oh, I guess this is my midlife crisis, or, next thing I know, I'll want a red sports car. And they'd almost try to sweep it under the rug as if it was their own personal problem and failing. And I just thought that as a psychologist and as someone who studied human development for most of my professional career, I felt there was something very meaningful and important going on emotionally and psychologically and developmentally in this stage of life and in this stage of marriage, and yet we really didn't have a useful framework for talking about it, that we all recognized this as a phenomenon, but we didn't really have a good language for it. And so I wanted to find a way to kind of dignify this and to really put it on the map of people's consciousness so that they didn't feel so alone as they go through this.
Well, and it's interesting, I think of people I know that just share things with me, and, there's a lot of people I know that are going through tough times. So your book's called The Rough Patch. What exactly is that?
Right. So it's obviously a term that we're all familiar with and we can all relate to, and that's one reason I wanted to use it in my title. But I think I mean a few different things by it. As I try to map out this period of life that I'm talking about, where we've sort of arrived at adulthood and think we ought to know what we're doing and think our relationships should just coast along and realize they don't, I'm talking about this moment of kind of maximum conflict between the sense that I've set up my life and the structure should work, and yet feeling that somehow it hasn't taken care of all my emotional struggle within, that there's unfinished business, there's emotional baggage, there's dysfunctional patterns in my relationships that I really need to address, and that is going to take a certain kind of digging deep into my emotional life that may feel messy and scary and inconvenient, but there's no real shortcut there. So that's one meaning I have for rough patch. The other is just to allude to all the different ways that people have crises and struggles over the course of a life or a marriage. And so the chapters are divided by different topics. And I'm hoping that someone who's struggling with, say, worrying that they're drinking too much, or that their spouse might be having an affair, or that, they can't get through their money and financial pressures, that they can go to the title, the chapter about money or about affairs or about alcohol and drugs, and they can find some immediate understanding, some immediate help, some immediate tools, and then hopefully, branch out to the rest of the book to kind of dig into my argument further.
Yeah. Well, and I know in your book you talk about, alcohol affairs and financial issues are some of the most common kind of rough patches that couple experience. What are some of the ones that are unique to the 21st century?
Yeah, so I think that there's some things that come about through the good development, the good cultural development of, the status of women changing and men and women having more egalitarian marriages. I think in this generation, more than any other previous generation, men and women in a heterosexual partnership sort of shoulder the burdens and the joys of parenthood and work and managing the household in a much more equitable way than ever before that they have in the past. So that egalitarianism is basically good for marriages on balance. It does contribute, it seems, to a lower divorce rate, but at the same time it means everybody's juggling a lot of different roles, having to have a certain amount of flexibility and a certain amount of collaboration. And so there's so many different areas where there can be miscommunication or problems handing the ball from one to the other. So that is a stress and a possibility and a potential, of course, but a stress that's particular, I think, to our era. And then another issue that's huge in people's lives is just the way in which technology permeates every aspect and every facet of family life. People come in and sort of have couple therapy sessions where they're arguing about whether their devices should be in the bedroom, at what time they should be turned off, should they be, reading their screens at night, what should they do with their kids. And I think that it's not only a thing where, technology is just part of every part of our life, but it's also become subtly a way to kind of detach and withdraw and sort of check out when you're not in a great emotional place with your spouse. So that can, of course, snowball, because the more you're feeling that the emotional communication isn't going well, the more you might tend to want to escape a little bit, and then the more that becomes a problem in and of itself. So I find that that's a huge issue for a lot of couples.
I can understand. It seems like more people are so attached to their devices that, just having a conversation seems to be something of the past almost.
Well, exactly. So the whole point of this book is you have to have conversations, and you have to have the hard conversations. But it's even hard for people to always differentiate. Am I sort of escaping onto my device because I'm trying to check out, or am I expected by my workplace to be available 24/7? Right? So we're in this time of real cultural change about how you create these boundaries and these limits, and I think everybody's struggling with that.
No, I've struggled with that myself. So I get it. And your book is just so beautifully outlined. It gives a lot of great information. One of the things that you talk about in your book is just, kind of at midlife, some of the depression that people tend to feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I do think that what's so hard about that moment where you sort of feel like you've put your whole life in motion, you've made the big choices, right, where you're going to live, what you're going to do for a living, who you're going to marry. And yet we're really complicated emotional beings, right? And there's a lot of fear we have, a lot of maybe bad habits in terms of expressing ourselves or communicating. There's a lot of stuff that each of us struggle with inwardly. And, emotions are kind of inconvenient and often inefficient and a little bit messy. And we all have such a feeling that we have to keep producing and keep getting our checklist taken care of that it's really hard to kind of have time to sort out emotions. I mean, I'm in the field of psychotherapy because I believe it's a central thing that people need to do in order to have a more satisfying life. But hopefully in a marriage, you can actually get support and understanding and warmth from this person you live with by sharing your burdens, sharing your confusion, sharing your honest feelings. And I think there can be barriers to that. And I think, when people are really sad often in their marriages or in this sort of midlife phase that I talk about, it's because they can't find that connection. So the book is really trying to help people in kind of a therapeutic way to figure out why, to have compassion for themselves and for each other, and to sort of give them a roadmap through that.
Yeah. Well, and I love in your book you talk about, what does marriage really commit people to? And that's a really good question. If you really sit and think about that, it's like, well, what are we getting married for? What's the purpose of doing this? And what's our goals at the end of this?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I say that in the chapter that's called Affairs flirting and fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
They're never about nothing. And the goal in that chapter is to say that, marriage is actually a creation between two people. We live in an era where nobody has to get married. You don't even have to get married to have children. You certainly don't have to get married to have sex generally. So there's reasons people want to marry, and I'm of the view that, your marriage is something you decide what its boundaries are, what its limits are, what its goals are. And people are, I think, being more flexible and creative in this day and age about talking about, okay, so how do we want to be married? Maybe we live apart some of the time. Maybe we even allow different partners. That's a minority view, but some people do it. In other words, it's just the good thing about marriage is it's just two people, and you get to decide. But, of course, if you're going to be that individual and that evolved and that sort of creating your own marriage, it's going to take a lot of conversations. It's going to take a lot of articulating what you think. And I think what you're alluding to is the fact that we all go into marriage with all sorts of beliefs that we haven't even made clear to ourselves. And it's only when they break down and we feel our spouse broke the contract in some way that we start realizing what it is we really expected. And so the more you can surface that stuff, the better.
Do you ever have clients come to you, patients come to you that are trying to define that for themselves and just need somebody to help negotiate the conversation?
Sometimes, but I think that to be at that point, you already have done a lot of work yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think what usually happens is that a couple comes in and one or the other feels that the other has kind of broken their unstated agreement in some way. I mean, there is kind of the obvious sort of agreements that people think they have, even if they haven't articulated them. For instance, we'll be sexually monogamous, or we'll each pull our own weight. But also there are other kinds of tacit emotional agreements that people feel they made, sort of unspoken contracts of the nature of the relationship. And in this period I'm calling the rough patch, it's very common for one person to say, okay, we got married 15 or 20 years ago, and this is who we were then. And I find now I need more affection, or I need more freedom, or I need us to share labor more equitably, or something. They feel that there's something that's a problem for them that maybe wouldn't have been a problem before, or there was no opportunity for it to become a problem, say before kids or something like that. And then the struggle is that sometimes the other person is like, hey, I hear you. It's scary for me to change, but let's figure out what we can do. And then I can sort of guide them through that process. But a lot of times somebody's saying, well, wait a minute, you changed the terms on me. This isn't fair. And in my view, if you're going to stay married over a long period of time, the terms are going to change. You are going to have to renegotiate and rethink because you're going to be changing as individuals. And so it's not some big betrayal when one person says, I realize I now need this thing, or I want this thing to change. That's just in the nature of being a human being. And the marriage has to be flexible enough and resilient enough to find a way to accommodate some of that change.
Well, and you bring up such a great point because no one thinks about that or how to navigate through that. My great-grandparents were married for, 60 years, but that's not really the norm nowadays. And so, as we're living longer and having longer relationships, and you talk about this in your book, it's like, how can we negotiate these terms so that we feel like we're getting our needs met?
Well, and I think what you're alluding to is a really important point relative to, say, your great-grandparents, right? Because we're living much longer than people did on average in that era. But also, our goal and our aspiration and our ideal of marriage is that it be this very close and connected, intimate relationship. And even though plenty of people in the past had close marital relationships, there wasn't the same pressure on the relationship to be that for both people, right? So that, to me, is a good thing, right? I think to be close to your life partner is definitely a worthy goal, and obviously this book is about helping you do that. But it is a difficult thing, right? Because you have to keep being vulnerable. You keep having to be open to the other person. You keep having to hammer out emotionally difficult topics. That takes time. It takes energy. It takes guts. And so we're talking about something that's genuinely worthy and genuinely challenging. And it's understandable that it doesn't always work out.
Well, and that brings me to my next question, and I just love how you just kind of peel this back so that it makes perfect sense for people. They don't have to be in therapy for years to kind of look at this and go, gosh, these are some of the things that we need to address. So you really get to the root core of the issue here. And so when you've got, let's say someone comes in and says, well, I don't know if I love my husband or if I love my wife anymore. Where can people go from there?
Right. So obviously that's one of these huge questions, right, that can come up for people in this kind of phase of life I'm talking about. And it come up in any phase, right? But that is truly a complicated question. Because as someone who's been married for 26 years and counting, I can say with certainty there are days that I have hated my husband. Does that mean I don't love him? No, I actually do love my husband, but sometimes I hate him. So that's one form of not loving your husband, right, or your wife. In other words, you're
I think
not
most people go through that, right?
And that's healthy. That's fine because you're a complicated person, and people irritate each other, and hopefully in a happy, fulfilling marriage, you feel like, I know this will pass. It's passed before. It'll pass again. But that's different from the kind of doubt that you're talking about. I think the kind of doubt you're talking about is a fear that actually the way it works between us, I'm not sure I can resuscitate a feeling of love for this person. I feel like somehow it's died or gone dormant, and I feel like the way in which we interact, the way we relate, actually doesn't foster that feeling coming back. Because the point is the feeling's not always going to be there. But you have to have some sense of confidence that the emotional communication and the relationship's working well enough that it does come back. And so I think when people come in that state, it really is a genuine question. Is this something not functioning between us that leads us to basically not feel loving toward each other? So my first hope there, if people want to stay together, and they often do, especially if they have kids, is to really address what the emotional process is between them that's so negative or destructive or not working. And, often people relate in dysfunctional ways because they never learned anything better. So this is really an opportunity to change your habits and your patterns for the better with this person that you've invested a lot of your emotion in. But sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes people try. They can't. They may chalk it up to some basic incompatibility. I have my own ideas about that. I think usually it has to do with both people not being able to really take responsibility and look at themselves. But whatever the reason, there are times when people feel, there's something so structurally problematic about this relationship that I can't really ever resuscitate my feelings of love for this person.
Yeah. It's interesting because, I think a lot of times when we look at things like if someone's had an affair, it just how that changes a relationship. And, have you ever come across people who are saying, gosh, that's kind of the end game, I can't come back from that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that is the big challenge of affairs, right? Because, the feelings are so powerful on the level of trust, on the level of deception, on the level of sexual jealousy. I mean, there's just so much that's painful in those situations that sometimes people feel I cannot, wipe myself off the floor and come back. Now, part of my job is to try to help people get through the trauma and the crisis of that in order to look at what they have and what they want to build. I mean, everybody who's in my field says you'll never have the same marriage you had, and part of it's grieving the loss of that, but you can build a new one. And what kind of marriage do you want to have together? And sometimes, if people work that through, they feel like, we're on a better footing now. That was awful. We wish it didn't have to happen through an affair, but now we're in a much more honest place. We're in a much more loving place. So that does happen. But sometimes, of course, an affair is sort of the death knell or the last straw. And, I think that's often common, particularly when someone says, I basically feel this person I'm married to is selfish, and I shouldn't put up with it. I mean, there's that scenario too. But I do think we're getting to a place, and a lot of people write about this lately, where it's kind of important to say, just to react to an affair as the reason to leave is probably not your best bet. It's really best to try to do the painful work of figuring out what the heck happened and see if you can get on a better footing.
Well, and usually, from what I understand from reading your book and just, just the information that I have, I mean, when people have this kind of experience that happens when the couples go through an affair, usually there's like something else that's leading up to all of this.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think, one thing I talk about in my chapter, I have a chapter called Love Sickness, which is sort of about, when people have kind of inconvenient, unbidden sort of crushes or emotional sort of affairs in their mind, or, that they get sort of carried away by some fantasy of another person, which is, quite common in my experience, in my practice. So I talk about the fact that sometimes that sort of thing happens because someone's just been through a loss or something traumatic, and they don't connect the dots, and they don't see them as related to each other. But say, for instance, a guy's wife has a scary bout of cancer, and then he finds himself infatuated with a coworker, or a child gets very sick, and it's very depleting and frightening to the parent, and then they find that they become infatuated. So that is actually a phenomenon that I don't think we've studied nearly enough, but I have seen it in my practice. But, I also feel that the whole question of affairs, you can create a story about why it did happen that has to do with the dynamics of the relationship. And that's not to say that only unhappily married people have affairs, because it's not true. Plenty of people who would say they had a happy marriage have affairs. But I think it is often a situation, in my experience, where there was some aspect of the relationship between the spouses that felt claustrophobic or limiting or constraining, or they couldn't talk about certain things, or certain kinds of topics were off limits, or one person felt controlled by the other. And it can be a way that people sort of offload or sort of find an outlet for certain kinds of emotions that they don't feel are really safe or possible to express in the relationship. And whether they can come back and actually reckon with that is really going to depend on who the two individuals are involved. Because sometimes these things break down where the person who had the affair comes back, they say, I want to work this out, and they feel that essentially they're punished forever, that there's never any closure and any resolution other than you did this horrible thing to me. So there's all sorts of ways this can go. But as a therapist, I'm always trying to help people actually deal with the traumatic aspect of this and have the patience to deal with that, and then to really look at where they are and see what they want to build now.
In your chapter, Affairs, Flirting, and Fantasy, you have this quote that I just love. It's generosity towards the other person might not be so hard if we recognize it as generosity towards ourselves. And it's interesting, a lot of times when people are in relationships, they don't even consider that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in that passage, I'm talking about sex, and I'm talking about the way people's sexual lives can break down. Mm-hmm. And I'm really urging people to, in a way, see sex less personally. I mean, we're so used to feeling that our sexuality is this core sense of ourselves, and if our partner isn't perfectly sensitive in this or that way, or doesn't know us in this or that way, or seems to want something when we're not quite ready for it, that somehow that's some, terrible reflection on our partner or ourselves. And I think that one benefit of long-term marriage is that you can have all sorts of different sex, and not that much is hinging on each incident. So you can have, bored sex, patient sex, make-up sex, passionate sex. And I'm sort of, in a way, saying, listen, give yourself permission to not feel that every sexual encounter has to be, the pinnacle for both people. Part of having generosity toward your partner is saying, okay, you want this, then it's fine. Or generosity toward yourself is saying, I might kind of enjoy myself, and if it's not, 100% and it's 55%, that's good enough.
Well, and that's fine, because it's part of a team effort.
Yeah, part of a team effort, and sort of a feeling of kind of friendliness, right? And not feeling that it's such a high stakes sort of referendum on, who each person is and how they care about each other. Sex has a lot of different functions in a long relationship, and I'm saying that's okay.
Well, and, you also talk about how society and stress affects a woman's sexuality. Can you expand on that for us?
Yeah, so this was so fascinating to me because in the course of doing this book, I obviously, see patients and get a lot of knowledge through that, but I also read a lot and talk to a lot of people and a lot of experts. And there's a guy named Ian Kerner who's a sex therapist in New York that I talked to, and he said this thing that really surprised me, but I thought it was an incredibly useful insight. He said, women tend to find that their stress level really interferes with their sexual drive. And women, as we know, tend to be the kind of masterminds of the household, for good or ill. They often resent it. They often also feel some meaning of fulfillment in it, but whatever. They've got a million things on their mind, and they're trying to keep tabs on all of them. And so to switch gears and to go to bed and feel sexual and feel sexy is really a tall order because there's all this stress on their mind. And so he, in saying that women's sexual drive is sort of interfered with often by all this stress, one thing he says is, hey, the male partner should be tuning in and talking to her about her stress because that's actually going to help her feel understood and relax and shift gears. And often it doesn't work that way. It's like, oh, you're so into your mind and you're so into your problems and you're not paying attention to me. And it's saying, no, really try to have that generous effort of like, hey, I want to help relieve your stress. I want to talk to you. I want to problem solve with you. So that's one thing. But the other thing he said, and this is the one that surprised me, is, fantasy can help distract you from your stress. So what's wrong with fantasizing while you have sex? And, I don't think people think that that's really the right thing to do, but he says that sex therapists say that it's actually a very common form of sort of, finding a way to get into a sexual mood.
Mm-hmm. And to make things a little bit more playful. I know millions of women around the world are cheering you on. Just, it's like, gosh, my guy's going to come up and ask me what's stressing me out or how he can help. And, what a relief that is.
Yeah, and for him to know, you might have read those studies a few years ago. It's like, couples have more sex when men do more housework, right? It's sort of a little bit the same idea that if he is tuning into what she needs, she's going to tune into what he needs. And, we know it's kind of cliche, but it can often break down into these negative cycles in heterosexual couples where he's saying, I'd be nicer to you if you'd have more sex with her and me, and her saying, if you'd be nicer to me, I'd have more sex with you, and it's sort of this cycle that they both get into, which is, if you just do this for me, I do that for you. And I'm really inviting men to say, hey, take the lead here. Say, I want to help you with your burdens. I want to participate. I want to talk about what's stressful and find solutions. That will make her feel more romantic.
Yeah, and then to really be an active partner in the relationship because it's really, how you said earlier, it's really engaging and talking.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say something about that in terms of gender roles and gender socialization. And I think, it would be possible for someone to hear me talk and sort of say, well, wait a minute, why should I have to learn how to talk? Talking is not my comfortable zone, or, why do we always have to be hashing out our feelings? But I actually do believe that developing facility with knowing what you feel and communicating about it is a huge, important life skill, and it's going to serve you so well in a relationship, and not everybody's as good as that. But I think it's something to aspire to be good at. And I do really take that value position because I don't believe you can be in a long-term relationship and be a person whose answer is, I refuse to talk.
Yeah, unless your best buddy is a dog, that's about it. But so, all joking aside, it's so important to have those communications in relationship. And I learned so much in reading your book about just how important communication is altogether.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that really is the sort of backbone of the book, and chapters 3 and 4 in particular are really trying to drill down into what we know from psychology in 2018 that we didn't know 40 years ago about emotion and relationships. And that, there used to be a time when I think people had this notion that emotions operated on this kind of cathartic model. If you get it all out, that'll be healthy for your relationship. Mm-hmm. And what we've learned is that's not true. What's healthy for your relationship is the same thing that's healthy for your relationship to yourself, namely, know your emotions, learn about them, become aware of them, and then be able to skillfully express them. What I say is the basic need in a couple is to be able to feel with each other and think about each other. If you think of the classic couple dilemma, where someone comes home from work and they try to unburden themselves about the stress of the day, and the other one steps in and immediately tries to solve the problem, and the first person said, I just wanted you to listen to me, right? So there we're dealing with, in a deep emotional or a close emotional relationship, we need two things. We need our partner to feel with us, to say, oh, that sounds hard, I'm sorry, what was that like for you? And to think about us, namely, was there anything I can do? When I think about it, maybe this would help. In other words, we need both things, and we need to do that for ourselves. And so that goes under the name of emotional self-regulation. It has a lot of fancy terms attached to it, but really managing that is the engine of harmonious relationships.
Well, and you talk about it so eloquently in your book, which we're not going to cover all of that because I still have a few more questions here, of course. I've got your book. I've got little tabs all over it because there are so many important chapters to it. I'm like, but we won't have time to talk about it, nor would we, because we do want people to pick up their own copy of The Rough Patch. But how does money play a part in relationships sometimes?
Yeah. So I think money is, across the board, a pretty stressful issue for couples. And it seems to me that it's stressful for different couples in different ways. I mean, obviously not having enough money is enormously stressful. Obviously job loss is enormously stressful. These are things that kind of easily put people into overwhelm and worry and anxiety, and that's never easy, right, between two people, because when you have anxiety, you have stress, and you have reactivity, and it's not always easy to deal with situations that are high stress. But what's really striking is that even people who have more money, and it's not really actually a matter of survival, money feels like an issue of survival, right? Because it lies so close to our sense of identity, especially probably in this country, but who you are is very wrapped up in your money, and also your sense of, do I have enough? Real sort of primal feelings about surviving. Am I valued? Am I valuable? What am I worth? Do I have enough? And so forth. All that means that it's very vulnerable to becoming part of a kind of zero-sum pattern of thinking between couples, right, where like one person wants this and one person wants that, and if I want this and you want that and I can't have what I want, then you're my biggest enemy because you're keeping it from me, or you're too much of a skinflint, or you're too much of a spendthrift, right? So people go back and forth sort of blaming each other for the limits that are necessarily part of finances, right? Most people can't have everything. Right, so there is a real way in which this can become a sort of constant batting back and forth of who's getting their way. And that is a mental state and a mindset that's very negative in marriage, because what you're aiming for is to say, okay, you want this, I want that. What do we need as a family? What do we need as a couple? Let's keep the marriage in mind. Let's keep the family in mind. Let's keep our shared creation of a relationship in mind and think, what's best for the whole, right? And that's not always easy for people to access, especially since very few of us grow up in families where money is talked about in any kind of open and constructive way. I think most people don't even have the language to talk about money, and then it becomes very infiltrated with emotion, and people can't talk particularly well.
Well, and do you find that when people learn the language to discuss money, that part of the relationship kind of smooths out?
I think it varies. I think there's a lot more written now and a lot more people specializing in how people can talk about money in a relationship. I think one thing that works against us in general is the cultural sort of attitude toward money, which I think makes people kind of kick the can, not try to engage in the hard conversations, deal with the limits, deal with the struggles, deal with the conflict, but sort of put it on the credit card and we'll figure it out later. Or when I actually look at the credit card, I'll yell at you and then it'll go underground for another month. In other words, people don't, try to avoid it, and there are a lot of mechanisms that allow us to avoid it, from mortgages to credit cards to you name it, right? So I think there is a way in which the culture in some sense conspires in these sort of dysfunctional patterns, but I do think people can make huge progress. And I think the important thing to remember, and a lot of the people who really deal with couples and money talk about this, is how deeply meaningful money is. It really does have very complicated sets of meanings for people, and part of coming to some sort of stance as a couple that you're happy with is understanding the deep meaning it has for your partner, right? So if my spouse grew up in a family where everybody was always worried whether they'd have enough food at the end of the month, and he has this sort of love of spending that I find sort of obnoxious or problematic, at least if I understand where it's coming from in him, it's going to be easier to work with him about it than if I'm just sort of blaming him all the time for what he's doing.
Yeah. Moving forward. Well, and I love the part in your book where you say also, in marriage, money can easily become a hidden currency for pressing emotional and spiritual questions, such as, and you talked about this, am I worthy? Will I be cared for? Can I care for myself? Do I have enough? And that is probably a little hamster wheel that a lot of people get on.
Right, and they don't know it's driving them, right? So this book is really about how do you become aware of these things, right? And the book is trying to help you become aware of them, because that is hugely powerful. If you can know why you're doing something, it can really help you do something different.
Yeah, kind of look at those beliefs and decide whether or not you want to continue believing them.
Right, and see that they're not just how reality is. They're an interpretation and a perspective in you that comes from somewhere.
Yeah, well, and now we kind of come to my next question, which I have quite a few friends going through right now, which is the empty nest thing. Their kids are taking off for college. How does that affect a relationship?
Right. One thing I'm really struck by in this is it's so variable. And it really depends on so many factors. I mean, I feel like for some couples, they feel sad their kids have left, and they may have slightly different sort of levels of sadness about that. But they have an experience of less stress and more freedom, because we all know taking care of kids, even when they're teenagers, or especially when they're teenagers, it can be hard, right? So they feel like, wow, we kind of have our dating life back in a way, right? That's the best end of the spectrum. But I think a lot of people, and especially in our culture, and for very good reasons, they invest enormously in their children. And the children become the dominant project of the marriage, which is totally makes sense, because a lot of people get married and stay married in order to provide a secure home for their children. But they sort of subtly deflect their energy and attention from the relationship into the children. And what I try to tell people is you're not going to be able to put the marriage on hold for 20 years and then come back to it and sort of it'll be the way it was. It's going to be a whole different ballgame. And so, to the extent that you have sort of ignored the relationship and invest in the kids, I think people get very scared. They think, I'm about to go off a cliff. I have no idea what we still share. I don't have any idea what we'll be able to create together. And in that situation, I say to people, look, it's okay not to know. It's okay to be beginners. I mean, I'd counsel people to not let the relationship just slide for all those years, but if they find themselves in that predicament, you're kind of at the beginning of something new, and you may be lost and confused, and that's sort of in the nature of it, and that's okay. Even if you're 50 or 55, it's okay to be lost and confused. And then there are the people who decided at some early point something like, I'm going to wait till the kids leave, and then I'm leaving. And in a way, to me, that's the saddest thing, because your life's going by all that time, and your kids are living in a house where people have basically become alienated and detached, and I don't think either of those are good things. So I understand why people want to live under one roof with their children, even if they're not happy with their spouse, and they might make a pragmatic decision to do that. But I think if you're finding yourself when your kids are in their middle years thinking, I can't wait to leave, I only have 8 more years, you really ought to question that, because I'm not really sure that that's that's going to end up being the happiest way to live your life.
Yeah, I've known people over the past that, they're just kind of waiting for the children to graduate because the marriage has pretty much dissolved, and they're just not in a place where they're happy. And the kids, they pick that up real quick.
Yeah. I mean, I think, poignant as it is to think about, I think, it helps children leave and make their own lives if they feel their parents are okay. And I think it's a very complicated thing to navigate, to feel like I'm leaving this house with this empty emotional relationship. In some ways I think it's better to try to be honest that you can't repair it and move on instead of wait. But I think people wait for very complicated sets of reasons, and it's not a one-size-fits-all problem.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I mean, and I don't do the work you do, but just in the small niche of friends I do, like one person would stay for health insurance, the other people for the kids, and so it's kind of an interesting. You look at it,
and I really do believe, both parents are very invested in the kids. The source of meaning is often living with their children, supporting their children, helping their children, and the idea that you would move out and live with your kids half time is unbearable to a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, when you do meet with people and they're kind of at that crossroads where they don't know if staying's the thing they want to do or leave, and you talked about this a little bit, what's some of the advice that you would kind of walk through with them?
Right. So, of course, as we're talking about, there's different stages of life. There's different trade-offs at different points of life. And, I really do believe it's the flip side of my saying a marriage is a creation between two people and only two people. It's also every situation is different. So my job in any situation like that is to really try to understand, both people, or if I'm seeing one person individually, try to understand that person. And I think in a general sense what I would say is if you're in a marriage where you feel that your own sense of integrity and truth, and the truth of the situation, is that the terms of the marriage are such that you can't really resuscitate your love for this person, then you're in a position that I think realistically the marriage will probably never be satisfying. And what I mean by that, I have a case in my chapter called Staying or Leaving. That's the 11th chapter of the 12-chapter book. And it's this couple where their child has an accident early in life, and the wife basically blames the husband for being irresponsible in this situation, kind of forever. Like she never can quite look at why she's doing that, what sort of the circumstances were that might go against that view of reality, and it was like she never gained any perspective on her tendency to blame him for everything. And he got to a point where he felt like, the only way to stay in this marriage is to swallow her interpretation of reality that I basically don't believe in, and to act as if she's right all the time. And in my own integrity, I can't do that. In other words, it so violates my own sense of reality and truth. So that's a situation where, someone may stay because they want to live with the kids, or they may keep trying to work it out. But basically, I sympathized with his feeling that all the evidence pointed to the fact that she would never take responsibility for her own part in it, and that would be true in 10, 20, and 50 years. So that's a really painful, difficult situation. But I think in that case, he decided to leave. In the second case in that chapter, it's a woman who's in her 50s, and it's that sort of gray divorce era, the sort of, I don't feel that connected. And in that case, we worked through, sort of looking at the big picture of her life and feeling that, what stake did she have in a certain sense of grievance toward her husband for not giving her what she wanted and not making her life just what she had wanted? And how could she maybe mourn the limits of the relationship but appreciate what was still good about it? They had a history, they had children together, they laughed together sometimes, they had some shared interests, and maybe she didn't need her whole life and her whole happiness and sense of meaning to revolve around that relationship. So that went in a different direction, So every situation's different, but I'm not in the tank for marriage in this book. I'm not saying the only way to be a successful, happy person is to stay married, because life is so much more complicated than that.
Oh, yeah, and there's so many variables. I mean, but I think in your book you cover, you give a very just an enlightening perspective. So people that are reading this, regardless of where they're at in their journey, they're getting more information, and they're able to kind of go, gosh, maybe I need to look at this differently.
Mm-hmm. That's the hope, because I really want people to feel they have some freedom to really consider where they are in their situation with a feeling of compassion and self-compassion. Because I think that's the attitude that's really going to help you get to the bottom of things best.
Yeah, and be able to move through that. Well, and so, Dr. Daphne, gosh, we could talk forever. I just adore your book. It's such a great, oh my goodness, it's such a great read. And of course, it's going to be in our book club. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
Yes, so I have a website, daphne-demarneffe.com. My last name is de Marneffe. And that, you can contact me through that. I'm on Twitter, and I'm on LinkedIn. And, one thing I'm thinking about, I'll just put this out there, is, partly as an outcome of this book, I do therapy with people, which I adore and I will always do, and I also write. But I do think sometimes about, what kind of classes or discussion groups or, what kinds of ways that I could connect, maybe, on Google Hangout or different ways that I could actually connect with people who are interested in learning more about these perspectives. So if anybody thinks that that's an intriguing idea, they should just, leave a message on my website. And, maybe that's something I'll do in the future.
Oh, I hope you do. I'm intrigued.
Okay. Well, write me.
I will write you for sure because, yes, I look at these things. I mean, because relationships are work. If there's one thing I've learned, and I don't nearly have the degrees that you do, it takes work. And part of it's just the dive into ourselves to learn more about who it is that we are and kind of, challenge some of these perspectives that we have.
Well, and, it's interesting you bring up work because this is always a hot-button issue, Do we have to just slog through and work away at these marriages, and what's the point, right? And there was a lovely article in thecut.com that was written based on an interview with me, and the idea of my book is that, the work is staying vulnerable and staying open, right? The work isn't have you gotten through your checklist and done this and that. The work is, do I keep showing up in this relationship willing to try to understand, to be understood, to be curious, to be compassionate, to express myself in a skillful way? That is work, right? Because we're not all emotionally perfectly healthy people. But what the hope is there is that in doing that, you're actually developing yourself too, right? And you're actually becoming a fuller person. And so there's benefit to that, but I'm not saying it's easy.
Yeah. Yeah, but, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, So,
well, let me just say on a hopeful note, okay, so people who have been married for a long time generally have a higher reported level of happiness, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that they've learned who this other person is, they've learned who they are, they know how to avoid the minefields, they know how to have some humor about their quirks, and they've learned to manage their own emotions better. So there's less flare-ups, there's less combustible interactions. And so there is a benefit to kind of just going along, and smoothing the stones as they bump up against each other, that people do report more harmony.
I love that. Well, Dr. Daphne, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
If you'd like to connect with Dr. Daphne and learn more about her book, The Rough Patch, you can visit her website at daphne-demarneffe.com. Her book's available on Amazon and all major retailers. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.